A well doesn't warn you before it kicks. That's the phrase every hand on an offshore platform learns in their first month, whether they hear it from a supervisor or learn it the hard way, the moment when formation pressure overwhelms the mud column holding it down, and thousands of feet below your boots, something starts pushing back. Most kicks get caught early and closed off in minutes, a routine part of drilling that never makes the news. The ones that don't get caught early are the ones that make the news for the rest of your life. My name is Delaney. I've worked offshore for 33 years, the last 19 as offshore installation manager on the Meridian Horizon platform, 40 miles off the coast, responsible for the safety of 140 people living and working on a piece of steel standing in 600 feet of open water. I've handled 4 real kicks in my career, closed off cleanly every time, and I've spent 3 decades believing that the difference between those 4 clean closures and a catastrophe came down to exactly one thing: never letting yourself stop paying attention to what the pressure gauges are actually telling you, underneath whatever else is competing for your attention that day. This is a story about the year my own crew, myself included, nearly did exactly that, not because we stopped caring, but because a system installed to help us pay closer attention ended up teaching us, gradually and without anyone intending it, to pay less. My daughter Claire married a systems engineer named Grant Pierce 6 years ago, a smart, earnest man I liked well enough at family dinners and had never once worked alongside professionally until Meridian Energy hired him, 18 months back, as the Horizon's new automation and predictive systems manager, a role created specifically to oversee the platform's transition to a new AI-driven well monitoring system called SentryWell. SentryWell was built to solve a real and well-documented problem in this industry. Kick detection, historically, depends on human drillers noticing small deviations in mud flow rate, pit volume, and standpipe pressure, deviations that can be subtle enough, in the middle of a long shift, to slip past even experienced eyes for critical minutes. SentryWell processed those same data streams continuously, cross-referencing dozens of parameters in real time, and was designed to flag anomalies faster and more consistently than any human monitoring rotation ever could. It's not going to replace your judgment, Frank, Grant told me, the week the system went fully operational, standing in the Horizon's control room with the particular careful diplomacy of a son-in-law who understood exactly how delicate this professional relationship needed to be handled. It's going to catch the things a tired driller 3 hours into a night shift might miss. I've been the tired driller 3 hours into a night shift, Grant. More times than I can count. I know exactly how much that concerns me. I want to be honest that I didn't dislike Grant, and I didn't distrust the underlying idea of SentryWell, not the way some old hands on this platform openly did. There's a particular breed of resentment that settles over a crew when new technology arrives promising to catch what experienced people are apparently no longer trusted to catch on their own, and I watched some of my longest-serving drillers wear that resentment openly in the system's first weeks, muttering about it over meals, treating the new monitors on the drill floor the way you might treat an unwelcome inspector sent to watch you work. I didn't share that resentment, not fully, because I'd spent enough decades in this industry to remember plenty of good hands lost to exactly the kind of slow, cumulative fatigue that a well-built monitoring system could genuinely help prevent. What none of us anticipated, in those first months, was the specific and corrosive way the system would actually fail us, not through some dramatic blind spot, the way I might have told you a story like this went in years past, but through something much more mundane and, in hindsight, much more dangerous. SentryWell's anomaly detection thresholds, as configured at installation, were calibrated conservatively, deliberately so, according to the vendor's engineering team, on the theory that a system prone to occasional false positives was safer than one prone to missing a genuine kick. In principle, that's sound engineering logic, and I understood it well enough when Grant first explained the vendor's reasoning to me over dinner at Claire's table, the two of us talking shop in a way that used to feel comfortable before this story happened. In practice, on the Horizon, it meant the system triggered a full anomaly alert, complete with an audible alarm across the control room and a mandatory response protocol, an average of twice a week during routine drilling operations, pressure fluctuations that turned out, on manual verification every single time across the first 4 months, to be ordinary variations well within safe operating parameters, the kind of noise that any experienced driller could have told you, on instinct alone, wasn't heading anywhere dangerous. By month 5, I watched something happen on this platform that I'd read about in industry safety journals for years without ever quite believing it could happen to a crew as experienced as mine: alarm fatigue, settling in exactly the way the literature describes it, one dismissed false alarm at a time, until the alarm itself stops functioning as information and starts functioning as background noise everyone's learned to tune out without consciously deciding to. Drillers started responding to Sentrywell alerts with a practiced, almost reflexive glance at the readout, followed by a shrug and a note in the log, rather than the full manual verification protocol the system was designed to trigger. I watched a driller named Cortez, a careful, methodical man I'd have trusted with anything in his first 2 years on this platform, silence an alert inside of 8 seconds one afternoon without ever leaving his chair, a habit that would have been unthinkable to him 18 months earlier and had, by month 5, become simply how the job got done efficiently enough to keep up with everything else demanding his attention on a busy shift. I noticed it happening in myself, too, which was the part that genuinely frightened me when I finally admitted it: 33 years of discipline eroding, quietly, alert by alert, not because I'd become careless, but because a system crying wolf twice a week for 5 straight months does something to even the most disciplined human attention that raw willpower alone struggles to fully resist. I remember catching myself, one Tuesday in September, logging a routine dismissal on an alert I hadn't actually looked at closely, and sitting with that realization for the rest of the shift with a discomfort I didn't mention to anyone, including Grant, for several more weeks. I raised the calibration issue with Grant directly in October, in a conversation I remember specifically because it was the first time our professional disagreement carried an edge that felt uncomfortably close to something personal. "The threshold's too sensitive, Grant. You're training my crew to stop taking the alarm seriously, and that's a more dangerous outcome than the false positives themselves. The vendor's recommendation is to keep it conservative through the first full year of operation, to build a reliable baseline dataset before loosening the thresholds. If we widen the tolerance too early, we risk missing something for the sake of reducing noise. I understand the theory. I'm telling you what I'm watching happen on my own control room floor. There's a version of this where the cure is worse than the disease." Grant didn't dismiss me. To his credit, he genuinely listened, took notes, and raised the calibration question with Meridian's corporate engineering office. What came back, 3 weeks later, was a compromise that satisfied no one entirely: a modest widening of the pressure fluctuation threshold, projected to cut false alarms by roughly 40%, alongside a corporate directive, driven as much by liability concerns as by engineering judgment, that all Sentrywell alerts still required a logged response within 5 minutes, regardless of an individual driller's assessment of the alert's likely validity. The false alarm rate dropped, but it didn't disappear, and the crew's trust in the system, once eroded, didn't fully recover just because the numbers improved. By December, I'd catalog it this way: if I were being precise, we were still responding to every alert, on paper, exactly as required. We were not, most of us, responding to every alert with the same quality of attention we'd have given a first alert, back before the pattern of false positives had taught our instincts something the procedure manual never intended to teach us. The night it mattered was the second week of January, a night shift like 100 others, drilling operations proceeding routinely on a new well section 14,000 feet below the platform. Sentrywell triggered an anomaly alert at 2:14 a.m., flagging a gradual, sustained increase in standpipe pressure alongside a corresponding decrease in mud return flow, a pattern the system's alert log described in the same clinical language it used for every alert, true positive or false, because Sentrywell had no way of communicating, in its own interface, that this particular pattern shape was meaningfully different from the transient spikes that had made up the overwhelming majority of the platform's false alarm history. Grant was on shift in the control room that night, a fact I've thought about more than almost any other detail in this story, because it placed the decision that mattered most directly in the hands of the one person on this platform whose trust in Sentrywell had been worn down by the same 5 months of false positives as everyone else's, compounded by the particular exhaustion of having spent that entire period personally defending a system that kept, in his own crew's eyes, crying wolf. I think about the specific unfairness of that, sometimes, that the person most professionally invested in Sentrywell's success was also, by simple exhaustion, among the least equipped that night to give its one genuine alert the attention it deserved. Another glitch, Probably, Grant said, according to the log and to two other men who were in the control room at the time, glancing at the readout before logging a routine acknowledgement rather than immediately escalating to full manual verification. I don't say this to condemn him. I say it because I understand, with total clarity, exactly how 5 months of near-identical false patterns can train even a careful, well-intentioned engineer to see one more variation of the same noise, rather than the one signal buried inside it that actually mattered. Cortez, working the same shift, later told the internal review that he'd noticed the alert too, glanced at Grant's reaction, and taken his own cue from it, a small, human chain of deference that meant nobody in that control room gave the 2:14 a.m. alert more than a few seconds of real attention. I was not in the control room. I was in my quarters, 3 decks up, half asleep after a long day of equipment inspections that had run later than planned, and what put me on the drill floor 20 minutes later was not Sentrywell's alert at all, it was my own habit, maintained privately and somewhat stubbornly across 18 months of automation rollout, of reviewing the manual pressure trend log myself before turning in for the night, a paper-adjacent ritual I'd never fully given up despite every argument Grant had made for why the digital system made it redundant. I'd nearly skipped it that particular night, tired enough that my own bed felt like the only reasonable destination, and I've thought since about how much of what happened next came down to nothing more disciplined than a stubborn, half-conscious habit I very nearly broke out of simple exhaustion. The manual trend log showed something Sentrywell's alert interface hadn't been designed to visually distinguish, a smooth, sustained pressure climb over 11 consecutive minutes, entirely unlike the sharp, transient spikes that had characterized every one of the platform's false alarms over the previous 5 months. It was a shape, not just a threshold breach, and shape was something my eye had learned to read across 3 decades in a way no dashboard number, however accurate, had ever fully replaced. I remember standing over that printed chart in my quarters, tracing the line with one finger, feeling something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion anymore. I called the control room directly, my voice steadier than I actually felt. Shut in the well. Now. This isn't like the others. Grant's voice on the radio carried the specific hesitation of a man who'd spent 5 months being told, by his own crew's growing indifference, that these calls usually amounted to nothing. Frank, the pattern's within. I'm not asking you to check the number, Grant. I'm telling you to look at the shape of the last 11 minutes on the trend chart, not just the current reading. This is sustained, not transient. Shut it in. He did, within 90 seconds of that call, initiating the blowout preventer closure sequence that every hand on this platform trains for in hopes never to actually need. The well shut in cleanly. Post-event analysis, conducted over the following week by an independent well control specialist Meridian brought in from Houston, confirmed that the kick, left uncontrolled for even another 10 to 15 minutes, would very likely have exceeded the blowout preventer's safe closure parameters, given the rate of pressure increase recorded in that final window. Grant came to find me the next morning, off shift, in the mess hall, and I want to describe what he actually said, because it was more honest than I expected, and more honest, I think, than I'd have managed at his age and his position. I dismissed it because 5 months of alerts taught me to dismiss it. That's not the vendor's fault, and it's not entirely the calibration's fault either, even though I still think the threshold was too conservative to start with. I built a system that was technically doing its job every single time, and somehow that was still the problem. You're not wrong about any of that, Grant. I dismissed plenty of those alerts myself, more than I want to admit to Claire's face. The number wasn't lying to us. We just stopped being able to hear it over the sound of every number before it. I don't know how you catch that in a system, Frank. A false positive rate low enough to keep people responsive, but not so low that you eventually miss the one that's dressed exactly like all the others. You don't catch all of it in the system. That's the part nobody selling automation likes to say in the pitch meeting. Some of it, you have to catch in the habits you keep even after the system tells you those habits are redundant. Neither of us pretended that conversations solved anything cleanly. Grant carried a real professional cost from that January night, an internal review that, while it didn't find fault with his individual decision given the information architecture he'd been handed, did result in Meridian restructuring Sentrywell's interface specifically to visually distinguish sustained pressure trends from transient spikes, a change that should have existed from the system's first deployment and didn't, because nobody building the interface had fully accounted for what alarm fatigue does to a crew's relationship with a dashboard over time. Claire and Grant are still married. Family dinners are a little more careful than they used to be, in ways that have mostly softened over the years since, though I don't think either Grant or I have fully let go of what that January night meant for how we each see the other's judgment. Claire told me once, months later, that the hardest part for her wasn't the professional fallout at all, it was watching two men she loved sit across a dinner table from each other, being scrupulously polite, both of them privately replaying a phone call that had lasted less than 90 seconds and had somehow become the measure by which each of them now quietly weighed the other. Sentrywell still runs on the horizon, recalibrated now with a pattern-shape algorithm that flags sustained trends differently from transient spikes, a change Grant pushed through corporate engineering himself, using the January event as the case study that finally got budget approval for work he'd apparently been requesting since the previous summer without much traction. He told me, the last time we talked shop honestly, that the hardest part of that whole redesign process wasn't the engineering. It was sitting in front of Meridian's corporate safety board and explaining, in plain language, exactly how a system built with good intentions and sound vendor logic had still managed to teach 140 competent people to trust it slightly less than it deserved, one reasonable false alarm at a time. The internal review didn't recommend any disciplinary action against Grant individually, finding, correctly I think, that his response that night was a predictable consequence of a system architecture problem rather than personal negligence. That finding mattered to his career, and I was glad of it, whatever complicated feelings sat alongside that gladness. It didn't change the fact that he has to live with how close that 90-second hesitation came to costing more than either of us likes to say out loud at Claire's table. I still keep the manual trend log habit, every night, off shift, the same ritual I'd have kept regardless of what any system told me was redundant. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust a dashboard, however well designed, the way I trust the shape of a line I've drawn with my own hand across 33 years of nights like that one. I don't think that distrust is entirely fair to the engineers who keep improving these systems in good faith. I also don't think I'm wrong to keep it. A well still doesn't warn you before it kicks. What I've learned, in the years since, is that a warning system doesn't automatically solve that problem either, if the system ends up warning you so often, about so little, that by the time it finally means something, you've already half stopped listening. The kick that mattered wasn't caught by the system that was built to catch it. It was caught by an old habit that refused to fully retire. The same night a good, honest engineer learned exactly how much even his own trust could be worn down by 5 months of noise before the one signal that finally counted.